The testimony of Sylvan Taylor is problematic for several reasons, the least of which is that, just like his wife Hattie, his testimony begins with an alternate writing style. We have identified this writing style as being an indicator that the testimony in which it appears has most probably been edited. As we discussed in our last video, the testimony of Hattie Taylor, there are no existing clues from the often told story to suggest that the editing in Hattie's testimony may have been. However, when we look at the testimony of her husband, Sylvan, similarities found in both testimonies gives us a clue. Both testimonies make it sound as if Hattie and Sylvan are practically forcing Dr. Taylor to leave the area for their sakes. There are two problems with this. The first is, in both testimonies, this is repeated verbatim. The second is, Sylvan will shortly contradict it. We believe that there are other omissions or redactions made in the testimony of Hattie Taylor. But without more information, we simply have no clue as to what those may have been. Not so with the testimony of Sylvan. In fact, the testimony of Sylvan Taylor is the most convoluted and the hardest to follow testimony in the transcript of the trial. The transcript shows Sylvan answering a line of questioning, then later answering another line of questioning. That is either for clarification or appears completely contradictory. We think this may be because of the huge mistake made by whoever edited the transcript. There is also another glaring, untrue statement made by both Sylvan and his wife, a statement that should jump off the pages in which it was recorded to us. But the appellate court would have no clue as to what you and I know about the Pound Gap Massacre. Information that may have been recorded in the missing 12 exceptions to the trial that was supposed to be attached to the very transcript. Information that is never mentioned in either the testimony or the defense or the prosecution, but strangely makes a brief appearance in the testimony of two witnesses called in the rebuttal of the defense by the prosecution. We are, of course, referring to the incident that happened just days before the arrest of Dr. Taylor. This incident would later become known as the Shootout at the Clefts of the Cumberlands. A quick note about the shootout at the Clefts of the Cumberlands. A quick note about the shootout. Although it appeared in the newspapers at the time, little else is known about it. Today we have three sources for this story: newspaper clips and the often told stories, and what little, and we mean very little, is recorded in the transcript of the trial. A year after the trial, the appellate court would only have what is recorded in the transcript. This fact is highlighted in the fact that Charles Johnson wrote about the shootout, but makes no commentary that the shootout was barely mentioned in the transcript. But Charles A. Johnson, former court clerk from the time of the Taylor trial, does ask some pertinent questions. The questions come before he presents the transcript in his book. He simply asks, to paraphrase, was Dr. Taylor given a fair trial? And was he proven guilty beyond all reasonable doubt? Johnson goes on to tell his readers to consider the evidence, then presents the transcript with no commentary. We believe that, just like us, in 1938, Charles Johnson thought that this transcript from 1892 had been edited. We also believe that he left clues throughout his telling of the Pound Gap Massacre. We also believe that at the time that he wrote his book, it would have been dangerous for him to make such an open statement. But other discrepancies and contradictions appear throughout Sylvan Taylor's testimony. Again, we believe these were possibly caused by very sloppy editing. There also appears to have been possible redactions or omissions in his recorded testimony as well. We shall discuss a few of them. Keep in mind that we are examining this testimony and the transcript of the trial using the historic lens of hindsight, something that, sadly, in 1893, the Virginia Court of Appeals did not have. The testimony of S.N. Taylor. The witness testified that he was the son of Dr. Taylor, heard of the killing, saw Dr. Taylor in Gladeville on Saturday before he was arrested, had been there about a week. He stayed at his house, but he did not know in which room. That he went with his father to Norton, and that he, Dr. Taylor, stayed at his house until he left on Monday morning. He bought him a new suit of clothes, everything a man wears complete. Dr. Taylor said he was going to Florida and then to the West. Witness gave him $60. Was certain that Dr. Taylor had only $24 on his person. Helped him to get off. Looked for a boxcar and told him where he could find it. Taking the Taylor's testimony together. Here, Hattie's testimony about Dr. Taylor's clothing and Sylvan's testimony about a boxcar seems to make perfect sense. But had Doc Taylor just spent a week in his own home? If so, why was his clothing in tatters as Hattie had testified? Was he preparing to leave the area disguised as a hobo? But there is a major problem with this statement. Dr. Taylor could not and did not spend a week in his home prior to moving to the home of Hattie and Sylvan Taylor. The shootout at the Clefts of the Cumberland had taken place either on Friday, July 15th, or early on the morning of Saturday, July 16th. The Monday in question was the 18th. Dr. Taylor was arrested on a train in Pearisburg, Virginia on Tuesday, the 19th. This means that Dr. Marshall Benton Taylor was taken into custody on the same day that the story about the shootout at the Clefts of the Cumberlands first appeared in the newspapers. Some versions of the oft-told story states that Sylvan had taken his father to the train yard and was spotted by a conductor. In these versions of the story, Prosecutor Bruce is notified and alerts the Baldwin Detective Agency. However, if he had been spotted in Norton, the conductor would have ejected him from the train, then notified the local police about a vagabond. This did not happen. Instead, a train conductor in Bluefield, West Virginia, spotted him getting off the train and reported it to the local sheriff. The sheriff could have arrested him for vagrancy, but was persuaded by the Baldwins not to do so. Herein lies another mystery. The Baldwins had been notified of a private bounty issued for Dr. Taylor. However, at the time, no arrest warrant had been issued. Had Dr. Taylor been arrested for vagrancy in West Virginia, it is likely that the Baldwins would have never obtained an arrest warrant. Additionally, had a warrant been issued, Taylor could have fought extradition. In this scenario, the Baldwins could have never collected the reward. As it was, they still had a couple of problems. Legally, they could not arrest Dr. Taylor and had to enlist the help of the Giles County Sheriff's Office to detain him. They then had to convince a Giles County judge to issue an arrest warrant. This brings up two 130-year-old unanswered questions. 1. Who issued the private bounty and notified the Baldwin Detective Agency about it? And 2. Why had the Wise County Court never issued an arrest warrant? Back to the transcript. Sylvan further testifies that he, meaning Dr. Taylor, stayed in the witness's kitchen loft or lumber room until Monday morning, when he left, was fed through the floor in the lumber room, advised his father to leave because he was not able to spare the money for the trial, and did not want to go through the trouble and suspense of a trial. That he had some witnesses in Kentucky which were out of the jurisdiction of the court, and he was afraid he could not get them. That there were rumors afloat that his father would be killed. That witness said that his father wanted to stay and stand his trial and objected to going away. The mystery witnesses. Where to start in this section of Sylvan's testimony? Notice that there are a lot of that statements in both Sylvan and Hattie's testimonies. Again, these testimonies read as if someone were taking notes and highlighting certain statements. They do not read as actual testimony from a witness. However, here is something strange. Like Hattie, Sylvan testifies that he encouraged his father to leave the area because he and his wife couldn't afford a trial. Yet, as we shall shortly see, Sylvan had a conversation with Campbell Carter that contradicts this statement, as he, Sylvan, had told Campbell that he wanted his father to come to trial, or more to the point, turn himself in, but more on that later. Here Sylvan testifies that his father had witnesses in Kentucky, but that he was afraid that he could not get them for the trial. The question here is, was this actual testimony, or was it added by whomever may have edited this testimony? Shortly after the trial, rumors emerged of people who were coming to testify on Taylor's behalf being stopped, threatened, and turned around on the Kentucky side of Pound Gap. The interesting thing here is that whomever wrote this testimony out added a caveat that these witnesses were beyond the jurisdiction of the court. Is Sylvan lamenting on the witness stand? However, this lamentation by Sylvan would soon be proven half true. But what of the rumors? One of these lamented witnesses, Mrs. Ellen Alley, would shortly testify. These rumors were about her daughter, Mrs. Frank Greer. Supposedly, Dr. Taylor had been attending her as she gave birth on May 14, 1892. The testimony of her mother, Mrs. Alley, partially attests to this rumor. The question is, how much of her testimony was possibly edited? The part about Dr. Taylor objecting to the idea of leaving the area is a half-truth. Taylor and the Flemings had sent 3 letters to the sheriff asking for an escort to the courthouse as they feared for their lives. It is important to note here that no arrest warrant had been issued. They were persons of interest and wanted for questioning. We also know from her earlier testimony that Mrs. Clifton Robinson had told Dr. Taylor that a member of the posse, led by Reuben McFall, had stated that he was going to kill Taylor. For whatever reason, Taylor had ignored this warning. Perhaps he trusted his ex-deputy McFall. But after the shootout at the Clefts of the Cumberlands, Taylor and the Flemings took this warning seriously and then, only then, went on the run. There is also another aspect about this shootout. Guilty or not, arrest warrant or not, posse or armed escort to court as Dr. Taylor and the Fleming brothers had requested. After the shootout, both they, the public, and the court considered them to be men on the run. Sylvan's testimony about the gun. Witness also identified his father's gun, which was a Winchester .45-75 caliber, and stated that it was in the same condition it was when he first saw it. After the killing, so far as he knew. Mrs. Amos Hilton had a .45-75 caliber Winchester, and that she lived in the same house he did. Wow! Where did this come from? The introduction of a piece of evidence of this nature is something that the prosecution would do. But here it seems that the defense is introducing evidence that could possibly damage their case. But there is another major problem with this snippet of testimony. For instance, there is no notation of the cross-examination in the testimony of Sylvan Taylor. Is this part of a cross-examination? We also know for a fact that the rifle had not been entered into evidence at this point in the trial. There would be a total of 5 more witnesses before the gun would be entered into evidence. J. S. Wright would testify to the shooting of the rifle during the trial. Sylvan would then be recalled to the witness stand by the court. At that point, Sylvan would only then testify about the rifle, and part of what he says is copied here almost verbatim. We believe this is another glaring error made by the editor of the transcript. But who is Mrs. Amos Hilton? We have no idea. But Sheriff's Deputy and witnesses for the Commonwealth, W.B. Renfro, had testified that George Hilton had been using the rifle on guard duty, guarding the jail and Dr. Taylor. This leads us to believe that Mrs. Amos Hilton is a fabrication of the editor. In fact, we believe this entire paragraph is a fabrication. It was created in order to give the appellate court the illusion that the rifle had been in evidence since at least the testimony of W.B. Renfro. Sylvan testifies to a conversation with Campbell Carter. That he did have a conversation with Campbell Carter. Don't remember exactly what he said, but thinks he told Carter he had written, or sent word to his father to come in and stand his trial. That this conversation occurred at Norton, in the drugstore, a week or so after the killing. That he wrote or sent word to his father to come in and stand his trial. We know this to be true because for some reason the prosecution calls Campbell Carter in the rebuttal, who verifies Sylvan's statement. This is extremely odd. The only reason that the prosecution calls someone in rebuttal is to rebut or try to discredit a testimony given by a witness for the defendant. This is usually done in conjunction with a cross-examination by the prosecution of the defense witness. Oddly, there appears to be no cross-examination of the testimony of Sylvan, or was there? Sylvan testifies to the reason behind the escape attempt. Afterwards, hearing that there was certain men trying to arrest his father, and believing him to be in danger of violence, and for the reasons already stated, he advised him to leave. Yeah, okay. Dr. Taylor and the Fleming brothers were, by this point, on the run. We will bet you dollars to donuts that Dr. Taylor had told his son the following. Mrs. Clifton Robinson told him that John Branham was a member of the posse or escort led by R.D. McFall, and that John Branham had made threats against the life of Dr. Taylor. He had also told his son about the shootout at the Clefts of the Cumberlands. At this point, no one, including Henry Adams, thought that the Wise County Sheriff was interested in arresting Taylor or the Fleming brothers. Not only did they take this threat seriously, but so did Henry Adams. Remember, Henry had also been indicted. But having a rock-solid alibi and not knowing of any threats, Henry had turned himself in and was out on bail. Some stories say that Henry had been at the Clefts of the Cumberlands that day. Some do not mention his name, but either way, Henry Adams also went on the run that day. He remained in hiding for 9 years. The charges against him were dropped in 1901, but, according to family, he lived out the rest of his life in fear that he would be arrested for a crime he did not commit. The last of Sylvan's testimony. The rest of the testimony is for the most part straightforward and needs no commentary. Returning to the transcript. Quote, my father carried his gun after he ceased to be a marshal. I don't know how long it has been since he ceased to be a marshal. I saw him about 2 weeks before the murder, and he had his gun then. I went from Norton to Gladeville to meet my father. I guess I got there about 10 o'clock at night. He had been home for about a week. He went from Gladeville to Norton, and he stayed at my house. So far as I know, he stayed at my house all day. We went to the main road. He rode and I walked. Unquote. This concludes the testimony of Sylvan Taylor. We at Kentucky Tennessee Living would like to thank you for watching our video series on the Killing Rock, otherwise known as the Pound Gap Massacre. Don't forget to hit that like button, as the more likes we receive, the more likely YouTube is to suggest our videos to other viewers. Also, to receive notice when we upload a new video, be sure to subscribe and click the bell for notification. We thank you for continuing to support Kentucky Tennessee Living as we are discovering the mysteries of Appalachian history. We must remind everyone that the story names Killing Rock, The Oft-Told Tales, Killing Rock, The Untold Story, Killing Rock, The Trial, and Killing Rock, The Defense are all under Kentucky Tennessee Living copyright.